and in remote regions of the world, the Ottoman Empire was constantly at war or facing incursions into its territory. And this meant that the Ottoman Empire was not as excited, let's say, to go to war as many of the European states were, right? You had this optimism. For example, in Britain, they were entering a war, the same with the Germans. This was a new conflict. How would it go? Of course, that optimism ended in about a month. But you had this sort of excitement about we're going to war. That was absolutely not the sensation within the Ottoman Empire. It was more of a, here we go again. And in fact, if you look at the declarations of war, there's only one declaration of war that the Ottoman Empire made, and that was the declaration of war against Greece in 1917. No, sorry, that was the declaration of war against, I'm trying to remember which one. But it's not, it's in the middle of the war. It's not even at the beginning of the war. I think, oh, sorry, it's against Romania in 1916. But it was the British, French, Russians, and Italians who declared war on the Ottoman Empire, not the other way around. And I want to give a sense also about, there's a question of what about the Greco-Turkish War of 1897? There were actually a dozen wars that I decided not to put on that list. And the Greco-Turkish War of 1897 was one of those. So I wanted to sort of do a triage of the biggest ones. So I also want to give a sense of how big the empires were. And so this is a map of the colonial empires as they existed in 1914 and the imperialist states. And you can see that the British Empire, the French Empire, these are massive international regions. Same with the German Empire and the Japanese Empire. And so you can really see how global this conflict would be, even if only even if only it was European states involved. I also want to sort of show the distinctions in population. So the countries in red are neutral states, the countries in orange are Entente powers, and the countries in yellow are Central powers. And you can see that the Ottoman Empire is less than half the size of Austria-Hungary and roughly a quarter the size of Germany in terms of population. The Ottoman Empire was small. And you can see also, if you compare Britain and France, they're both significantly larger than the Ottoman Empire in terms of population as well. That British number is probably buoyed significantly because of India. So if you take out India, the United Kingdom drops down to about 100 million. And then within the British Isles itself, it's about 40 million. So the Ottoman Empire was expected to be a weak state, right? As we were talking about a little bit earlier, there's this idea of the sixth man of Europe, that the Ottoman Empire was just waiting to fall, that in 1878, the Russians had done quite a number on it, so had the Balkan Wars, the Italo-Turkish War. The Ottoman Empire was literally one strong wind away from collapsing. And that was something that the Ottoman Empire would strive to prove against. Another thing that I want to point out while I have the population map here is that Persia and Arabia have significantly less population than the Ottoman Empire. And for those people who are familiar with population numbers in the Middle East today, these numbers look rather surprising, I'm sure, to many of you. Germany today still has around roughly 80 million people, which is not much different than it did during 1914, because the German population would keep growing and then they keep losing it during the World Wars. But the population of the Middle East went through a massive explosion between the year 1940 and the year 1990. And it's still on a quite a high rise as well. But the population numbers that we're familiar with, like 80 million for Iran, are completely developments of the 20th century. Coming into the 20th century, Persia had 7 million people. At its historic height, previous to that, it would have been the Sasanian Empire. Was the last time that the Iranian population was so high, anything close to where it is today. There's a question of, is it true that statistically speaking, the British Empire acquired 25% of the world? I don't know if it's exactly 25%. It might be something a little bit less than that, but it's around a quarter. So it's either 20 to 25%, somewhere around there. It's certainly like that if we look at population. The entire world population at that time was 1.75 billion. And you can see the British have roughly 400 million under their leadership, which is about 1/4, somewhere between 1/4 and 1/5. Another thing that I wanted to sort of show are battle casualties. And we can see that the Ottoman Empire lost fewer people than many of the Entente powers. France, United Kingdom, Russia lost significantly more people. Now, of course, the reason why the Russians, French, and British lost so many people during the war was because of the trench warfare on the Western Front and on the Eastern Front. That's why the Germans suffered so colossally. And in fact, Ottoman losses were much more on the civilian side, for reasons that we're going to discuss in a little second. But you can see the casualty ratios. The Entente military suffered more than the Central Power military, but the civilians on the Central Power side suffered more than those on the Entente side. But we should be very clear how massive this war was. And in total, it's estimated that roughly 40 million people died as a result of the First World War, which makes it one of the biggest wars in history. So I want to compare France and the Ottoman Empire just to sort of drill down on this a little bit. If we see, for example, the Ottoman Empire lost a few fewer military deaths than France, but compared to its population, it made a much bigger sacrifice. But its civilian population suffered much more tremendously. Of course, half of that 4.2 million number is the Armenian, Assyrian, and Pontic Greeks who were eliminated in those genocides. But half of that number, around 2 million or so, 1.5 to 2 million, is Muslim civilians who were living within the Ottoman Empire. And these were civilians who were killed in, generally speaking, Russian or Armenian militant attacks, civilians who were killed as a result of occupations within the Ottoman Empire, and other serious issues, starvation, famines, things like that. And so you have a lot of pain and suffering on the Ottoman side, even if the numbers are not as, even if the numbers of military dead are nowhere near as high as the numbers of French military dead. So let's talk about how the war actually started, right? So you have this situation where, as we talked about in 1908, Austria-Hungary annexes Bosnia, and it becomes part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the crown prince of the Austro-Hungarian throne, visits Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, and he does so as part of sort of a get to know you, where he meets the local population. As a result, guards were rather thin on the ground. And the Black Hand that Apis, as I mentioned, organized, had 6 individuals tasked with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand while he was in Sarajevo. They believed that while he was there, he would be an easier target, which was true. He had fewer guards and he was closer to where Serbia was. Additionally, the people who were involved were local to the area and so could maneuver more effectively. That said, the assassination nearly failed. The first wannabe assassin had, well, he sort of clenched up in the moment, I think is the easiest way to say it. The third one tried to throw a bomb into the carriage, but it bounced off. And that bomb exploded, leading to a number of wounded going to the hospital. Archduke Franz Ferdinand wanted to go to the hospital despite the recommendations of all the local officials saying that he should leave and avoid further possible harm. But his driver actually got lost and pulled into a dead end where Gavrilo Princip, who was the 6th member, and was just relaxing in a cafe, saw the Archduke out of his window, cornered in the dead end. Gavrilo Princip took out his pistol and he shot both Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, Sophie